welcome to the Industrial Revolution. All right, we are on a revolution here, a revolution streak. We just got done with 2 revolutions. What were those 2 revolutions we just talked about in chapter 23? That is right, the American and the French Revolution. What kind of revolutions were those, if you had to categorize them? Political, right? And what makes political revolutions unique is that there's bloodshed, right? So it's the overthrow or change, to revolutionize, to change, to revolt against, and to bring change against your government and the way you are governed, okay? And we see that in the Americas. We see that with the French. We saw that the American Revolution was successful. The French wasn't. We went into all that detail of why the French failed, why the American colonists were successful, their training, their history, right, of the constitutional monarchy, their experience with voting, and stuff helped them set up a republic, where the French, having no experience, really kind of set them up for failure. It would be like me going out and never skating before and thinking I'm going to go join the Olympics in 6 months and get a gold medal. It's just unrealistic, okay? In chapter 24, you have to understand these revolutions, this is going on at the start of another revolution, except it's the Industrial Revolution. So if you had to categorize what kind of revolution is the Industrial Revolution, what would you say that falls into? Economic, right? If you look at your life, okay, or the life of any society, you can basically break it up into a pie. There's the political aspect, the economic aspect, and the cultural aspect, right? So political is the way we're ruled, who's in charge of us, who makes our laws, okay? Economic is the way we make our money, right? How we make a living, okay? And then culture is the way in which we live, right? So that's our language, our religion, our beliefs, and our personal kind of day-to-day experience. So the Industrial Revolution is going to be a revolution of economics, the way people made a living, the way things are manufactured, the way people make money, the way societies make money, the way things literally are manufactured. And it's a change, it's revolutionized through technology. All right, so you're going to want to have the PowerPoint for sure. This is one you're going to want to take notes on. This is a long one. There's a lot going, and I'm going to do it in one long lecture. So if this is a lot for you, you might want to break it up because it's probably going to be a longer lecture. But I'm going to power through it, okay? And then I would grab your questions. All right, the date range for this chapter, the Industrial Revolution, the change of economics. And when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we're really talking about Western Europe. Okay, where is this happening? This is a Western movement. This is going to be about 1760 to 1851. This is going to be in Western Europe, England, Germany, France, eventually the United States, okay? So after the Declaration of Independence, we're going to be a little later to the Industrial Revolution, so Europe will start and we'll kind of be a little later to the party, but we will be a part of it. And key groups or civilizations is definitely going to be Europe and the Americas, United States in particular, okay? So, you know, where does it start? So let's jump in. It started first with agricultural changes. So it's not just like overnight technology changes. It started with agricultural changes. So it started with changes in farming, okay? And there were a couple things that really changed. So first, there was what was called the enclosure movement. So let's talk about what this was, okay? So the way that England or Western Europe worked is that most landholding elite lords, let's say they had 10,000 acres, okay? They would break up that estate into smaller farms that tenants would lease from them. So they would have, let's say I had 1,000 acres, let's say I had 20 tenants, so 500 acre plots. So if I had 10,000 acres, break that up into 20 500 acre plots, so I had 20 tenants that pay me rent, and I'm the Lord, okay? So say 20 of you students have farms on my land, okay? And so that's your long-term home. You've lived there for generations, as long as you know, but I make money from you working your property. So you maybe have a small farm or you raise crops and you make money out that and you pay me taxes, you pay me rent, okay? What lords started to realize is that it was inconsistent. Here's the problem. Not all tenants pay rent, and there's always a problem. Oh, it was a bad crop, or, you know, so-and-so died. And there's always an excuse why people can't pay rent. And us rich lords, you know, we're sick of hearing the excuses, sick of hearing about your plight and why you can't pay rent, okay? We want our money, all right? Don't you know how hard it is that I had to have the same meal 3 times this week? Well, you poor people are probably thinking, kidding me? I've been having the same meal for the last 20 years. You know, must be nice, okay? But They were tired of the stress of they realized that they could make more money if they didn't have to deal with their tenant farmers. If they got rid of all the farmers and they enclosed, here's that enclosure thing, enclosed their massive estate into one large plantation, so to speak. Okay, so I got rid of my 20 tenants and I decided just to grow one crop. Okay, now I just made 20 farmers homeless, right? They have nowhere to go. They can't buy property. They have no other skills. They're uneducated. They don't have other skills. They're farmers. They can't just go get a normal job. What's a normal job? This is their livelihood. This is their home. Like, they have no other place to go. They have nothing they can do. I don't care about that. I want to make money. The enclosure movement was lords getting rid of their tenant farmers and taking back their land and growing cash crops like what was happening in the Americas because they could make more money off of it. They could change the crop or whatever was the big thing. So I could change it to wheat or to sugar or to cotton or whatever was the big crop of the time, and I could make more money. And that way I didn't have to deal with all you tenant farmers. Now I know I'm sounding very, insensitive right now, but you have to understand the analogy of what I'm getting at. Now, what I did was I created a labor pool, right? I need people to work that. So some of those farmers I can hire back to work for me, but the reality is I don't need all of you. So some of you are now homeless. So what happens to that population? What do? Well, it creates a labor pool, okay? People who need jobs. So, but those laborers have nowhere to go, so they move to the cities. So all these laborers move to the cities. Well, what happens is that farms, large estates like, let's say mine, okay, start producing more crops because they're producing one type of crop. There's better fertilizers, and we have better machinery now. They have what's a seed drill, which is a type of plow that plows the soil, digs a hole, plants the seed, covers it up, all in one machinery instead of 5 or 6 different steps, okay? So not only do we have better technology, we're being more efficient with the land, but so the rich are getting richer, but the poor have nowhere to go. So the poor move into the cities. And the poor are now available for labor type jobs because, let's be real, that's all they're qualified for. They're not educated, they're not highly skilled, they're farmers. And not that that's not great, but that's not super helpful in any other area if you can't be a farmer. Well, there's no land for them to go buy, and so they have no choice but to go to the cities. So as new factories and manual labor start to open up in the cities, there's a labor pool that needs jobs that moves to the cities and starts working in these factories that will open up in the cities, okay? And stuff. Now, the population, there's going to be a huge population explosion in Europe from 1750 to 1789, okay, from 120 million to 190 million. Now, it's not due to declining death rates, okay? It's not rising birth rates. So what is it? It's better quality food, okay? So people are living longer. People are living longer. So babies are being born, but people aren't dying at the same rate. So it's due to declining death rates. So it's not that more babies are being born, it's less people are dying. And so you have more and more people, which means you need people to be employed. The Industrial Revolution is going to start in Britain, and here is why. And this is question number 1 off your questions. So listen to this short little video, and then we're going to go over it.
To picture England before the Industrial Revolution, we must imagine a nation that was the most powerful on earth, and yet possessed no real factories. A country that had just one large city, London. For the most part, England was a quiet and lovely land of farms and rural villages where only the sounds of weather, of animals, and the distant ringing of church bells broke the stillness of the landscape. Yet England was a land of great social inequality. A handful of aristocrats owned most of the land and possessed by right of birth nearly all of the incredible wealth it yielded. They built magnificent palaces for themselves and filled them with treasure, while an enormous lower class, most of whom owned no land, struggled to survive, often paying rent to the wealthy landowners. These poor people sometimes faced severe malnutrition and even starvation. They usually died young. With this as a background, let us
So Britain leads the way. Why does Britain lead the way? Let's look at why. Natural resources. They had a large supply of coal and iron. Okay, no one had more than they did, and this was the new form of it replaced timber, right? Okay, and so they're the largest supplier of this and producer of this. So this is a huge money maker for them. Okay, they had an increased labor force due to the enclosure movement and the increased population. So they had the workforce for the factories. They had the technology. They were the first to develop the steam engine. The steam engine is going to become the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. So just like the printing press was the backbone to the Protestant Reformation and to the Renaissance, the steam engine is going to be huge. And the British will be the first to develop the successful steam engine. So having the technology was also really important. Plus, they led the way with the Enlightenment. You know, you have to think about it. The Enlightenment was about progressive government. What was the first European country to be a model or an example of something other than an absolute monarchy? That would be Britain with a constitutional monarchy, right? So they were the first to really be progressive in Enlightenment ideas. Their economics, because they had a constitutional monarchy and they had a parliament, a House of Lords, a House of Commons, their taxes and their trade laws tended to be more favorable toward businesses because business owners like lords and landholding elite were a part of the decision making versus like Spain, France, Germany, Italy, other countries that had absolute monarchs. Their landholding elite were not a part of the decision of taxes, if that makes sense. So it was economically, it's kind of like how, let's keep it real, California has really high taxes, right? They have income, they have state taxes, they have really high property taxes. So a lot of people actually right now are moving to Nevada. Why? Because we have low property taxes. We have income, I'm sorry, we have sales tax, but we have no income tax. So a lot of people like to move to Nevada. Surprise, surprise, not because we have a lot of greenery, but because it's a very affordable place to live. So in the same way, a lot of businesses were attracted to Great Britain because it was a good place to live for business. And politically, like I said, they were pro-business because they had a constitutional monarchy, and so businesses could really thrive due to their representative government. The steam engine is going to be one of the most important technologies of the revolution. So number 2 on your questions is, what 4 revolutionary innovations? The steam engine should be one, and then we're going to go through some others, but you better make sure that the steam engine is one.
For this reason, a new invention called the steam engine came into wide use in factories, and because it used coal for fuel, it was no longer necessary to build factories next to rivers. Although steam engines had begun to be used to run machines as early as the 1720s, it wasn't until the late 1700s that steam power started to be used in factories really efficiently. A steam engine works like this. Water is heated by wood or coal in a boiler. As steam is produced, the pressure in the boiler increases. By turning a handle, the steam enters the engine through a valve. The steam pressure then pushes the piston down, which in turn moves a heavy flywheel. Then the piston is returned to its starting position as high-pressure steam pushes on the other side of the piston. When the engine is running at full speed, the piston moves back and forth very rapidly. Pulleys or gears attached to the flywheel can then be used to run almost any kind of machine.
So the steam engine is the most revolutionary innovation of the Industrial Revolution. Like I said, it is the backbone, okay? It is the printing press to the Renaissance. The steam engine is to the Industrial Revolution. And the reason is because it's an engine that can be modified and used in a factory. It can be used on a train. It can be used on a steamship. It's an adjustable engine that can be used in any kind of manufacturing and also eventually transportation. So the steam engine is really, really big and stuff. So you definitely, James Watts is going to be a big part of that. You want to make sure that you know that for the test. The textile industry is probably going to be one of the big industries we see changing also during the Industrial Revolution. So the put-out system, India is going to be one of the #1 colonies of England. So we talked about how England is going to be huge in westernization and imperialism and getting colonies. They're going to have more colonies than anybody else when we get into imperialism. And India was their main colony, and they were the #1 producer of cotton in the world. So they had the put-out system, which is literally where low-income women in India, okay, would go to the cotton fields. They would get bundles of cotton. They would go into their home, and they would produce cotton textile. They would put out from their home. This is where it gets the put out system, from their home, weaving of cotton from spools of cotton. If you've ever seen like a cotton ball, like raw cotton, okay, and they would turn it into yarn that could then be woven into textiles, okay. This was a long, tedious process, but this was like a #1 employer for lower class women in India, but it was very, very slow. So the innovation of the flying shuttle and weaving machines is going to be huge for changing the cotton industry, and probably one of the first examples of a breakthrough in the Industrial Revolution. So the cotton industry is definitely something you should have as one of your innovations, okay? The cotton industry, the mechanization of weaving. And so we want to have mechanization. So the spinning jenny in 1764, the water frame in 1769, the mule in 1785. These are all a part of the cotton industry, okay? That are going to lead to a speeding up of, so literally by the 1800s, the English will forbid the put-out industry in India. All those women become unemployed, and they will start exporting raw cotton back to England to then manufacture the cotton in textile factories, where they can literally put out cotton 10, 15 times faster than these women could. Now, great for England, right? Because they're producing it 10 times faster, but who just economically became hurt? India, right? All those lower class women now are unemployed and have no jobs. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution, okay? The Industrial Revolution is going to be many successes, but at a cost. Okay, like I mentioned in England, the lords made more money, right, by enclosing their land and producing crops, but at what cost? Right? All those homeless people, those farmers who had lived there for centuries and now had to go and work in the factories for less money in horrible working conditions. So many times revolutions are at a cost. It's a positive for a negative. Political revolutions, political change at the cost of many deaths. Industrial Revolution, it's economic change. So a change in which how we do things, and a mechanization, and we're faster, and this sounds great, but the cost is the lower class. And you're going to see this time and time again, how the lower class suffer for this. Here's an example of the spinning jenny and a weaving machine, and how it enabled literally the job of one person to speed that up 6 or 7 times. So you get it economically, but the problem with the Industrial Revolution is there was nothing in place to help people who when they were replaced. So the Industrial Revolution spread. So it started in Britain, okay? It started in Britain because they had the abundance of coal and iron and stuff. But who's going to catch up? Well, France will catch up. Germany will catch up. The United States will catch up. Why? Well, they also had an abundance of coal and iron, okay? Britain led the way. Britain kind of, did the hard work, so to speak, and they stole their technology. Think of it this way. When you're learning to do something for the first time, you're discovering something, think about how many failures that person must have. Think about Thomas Edison and light bulb. How many failures he must have had before he had, the one successful. And then everybody after that, it's easy to do it, right? How many failures did Britain have with factories, with the steam engine before they got it right? Well, now United States, France, and Germany can just take those blueprints. There's no failures. They just build it right the first time. How easy for them? They have a lot more natural resources than Britain. Remember, Britain is an island nation. Now, they have colonies that help them, but their own island nation, they didn't have a ton. So Germany is larger. France is large. United States is huge with untapped territory. And by the 1800s, United States is expanding to the West Coast and getting tons of natural resources. So what are some new methods of production? Okay, well, there's kind of 3 new methods of production. There's interchangeable parts, okay? Now, interchangeable parts are important because it's how we look at doing something, okay? For example, a tire is an interchangeable part. A battery is an interchangeable part. It's the idea that we create one thing that serves many different purposes. Think about probably one of the most interchangeable parts that exists, a AA battery. right? Think about how many things that goes to. Therefore, it drives down the cost of the battery because so many people buy it because it goes to so many different things. Imagine if you had to have a different battery for every single electronic that you had. Imagine how expensive those batteries would be because those batteries would be so unique. Here's the rule of thumb, right? The more readily something's available, the cost goes down. The more rare something is, the cost goes up. So interchangeable parts helps to create something that is very usable to the public and drive the cost down. So interchangeable parts is something like a tire, a battery. Interchangeable, aka goes to many things. Just for a few examples, a light bulb would be an interchangeable part, goes to many different things. Okay. Assembly line is another new method of production. So it used to be, let's say, for instance, the production of porcelain in China, that a master from beginning to end would produce one china set, and it could take them months, and that china set would be worth so much money that only the elite could get it. And if something happens to that master, right, then that whole art is gone. But if you take, let's say, the 20 steps that it takes for that master to produce the porcelain and the china set, and you break it down into 20 unskilled steps so that 20 different people not only are producing 20 different pieces at the same time. So you have a method of production, different stages, but 20 at the same time versus one person who does every single step. You're producing more, you're producing faster. And then let's say that person number 5 on the line gets sick. Well, I just get rid of them and get somebody to replace them, and in half a day I've trained them to replace them. So not only do I produce more by taking the assembly of something and breaking it down, I also devalue the job. Does that make sense? Because now instead of having one person do 20 jobs, I have 20 people doing one job, right? And if all you're doing is one job, you're not that valuable because I can train most people to do one job. If one person is doing 20 jobs, think about how much skill that takes, how valuable that is. You know what I mean? And so assembly lines actually speed up the production of things. Let's say like a car. Okay, assembly line of a car is going to greatly drive down the cost of a car so that no longer is it just an elite thing to purchase. It drives down the cost because they can produce more. It's cheaper to produce. And now middle class people can buy it, therefore they have more of a market, and it leads to mass production. Okay, so the idea of these new methods of productions of interchangeable parts and assembly lines leads to, instead of just the rich being able to buy things, because it drives down the cost, interchangeable parts leads to mass production. Assembly line leads to mass production, which leads to affordable products that you and I, normal people, can afford, and totally changes the market so that middle class people can afford what used to be just wealthy people. What are some other technologies? Steel industry is going to be really, really big. Steel industry is huge, okay? The pottery industry is going to be big. The chemical industry is going to be huge. Thomas Edison's light bulb is going to come out, in the 1800s and start lighting up cities. Steel for the very first time. Steel was a really big deal. It's a purification process of iron, and steel is better than iron because it's lighter, but it's more pliable, and it's going to lead to the building of skyscrapers. Prior to steel, you really don't see buildings more than maybe 3 or 4 stories high because they were just too heavy and they weren't sturdy enough and they would collapse. Steel leads to skyscrapers, right? We can build up. And that steel is really important because it's light enough and flexible enough, but sturdy enough. New chemicals, medicines, the medical field is going to take huge advancements in sterilization, aspirin, painkillers, perfumes, soaps. You and I started smelling a whole lot better. Okay, fertilizers. Here's a funny one. Dynamite will be invented during this time. Now, when you think of dynamite, what do you think of? Explosive, right? How many of you have heard of the Nobel Peace Prize? Here's a funny quick story. So Alfred Nobel so desperately wanted to contribute something very meaningful in life, okay? And he wanted to, something in the medical field or something that was going to greatly help humankind. And he is the one who invented dynamite. Which, can you think of anything more destructive, okay? And this man made more money than God. This man was so filthy rich off of something that brings a lot of destruction and killed a lot of people. Because dynamite then is eventually not just used for mining, right? But is evolved into weaponry. And he was so mortified by this, so disappointed with himself. He's like, I've hurt mankind. I haven't done anything to help mankind. This is unacceptable. I can't believe this. totally upset about this, okay? That he left his fortune and he set up a foundation so that people who do help others will be recognized, called the Nobel Peace Prize, right? So that annually or yearly, people who do bring about peace or do good things in the world would be recognized. So a man who became wealthy for inventing something that brings harm leaves behind, or his legacy is the Nobel Peace Prize. Isn't that kind of funny? All right. We have the electric car. We have, like we said, we have the first electric telegraphs. You know, the Industrial Revolution is just such a huge movement of not only technology, but just the way we live and we produce and the quality of life. Transportation is going to make a huge change, right? From horse and carriage to automobiles. Now, not is it just that the first automobiles come out, but then with interchangeable parts in the assembly line, you see the production of them, again, go from something that was very wealthy to something that is more affordable by the early 20th century, by the early 1900s. By the end of the Industrial Revolution, we see the actual first flight, okay, the Wright brothers. Now, I don't know if I would call this a flight. This was less than 20 seconds. I would call it more of a glide, okay, but still, you know, within 30 years of this, by the 1930s, we have commercial flight, right? Where now we take flights everywhere all the time. It's really awesome and amazing. Just, I mean, think in 100 years, 120 years, you know, here we are, you know, 2020, how far we've come. Think about automobiles, think about airplanes, think about travel, and just, I mean, nobody takes a train anymore. Train used to be the only way people traveled if you went long distance. And they've become obsolete almost for travel, for human travel. I mean, some cases you see trains, but it's definitely not the majority, right? Maybe within the cities for commute travel or something like that, but not the norm. It's really amazing how much things have changed. Communication is going to be huge. The first telegraph, you guys, and not just telegraph, but then the first telephone. Now, what's so cool about the first telegraph is that they were able to develop the first undersea cable. Now, the first telegraph was using Morse code, right? So it's not actually talking on the phone, but it's sending through a coded message like an email, right? But except it's a coded message that you could write out, then it's sending a telegraph. It's like sending an email, but you're doing it through Morse code, right? And then they would write that down and they would deliver it. Now, think about this. If you were in the United States and you were trying to send a letter to Europe, it would not be uncommon for that letter to take a month to get there by the time it traveled by ship. By telegraph, it could be there in a day. That's like you and I sending something snail mail. It could be somewhere in a couple days versus sending a text message where it's instant. You know what I mean? That's the time change that it does, okay? So think about what this does to business. Think about before, if I was doing business, if I'm in the United States and I'm doing business with someone in Europe, and to communicate, I have to send a letter. How long that would take versus now I can send a telegraph, and in a day I can do business. I can change an order. I can communicate about a problem. Do you know what I mean? Same thing with us. Think about just in everyday communication. Think about with your own teachers being online this year. Think about if you had to communicate with me via, you know, mail, correspondence versus our live sessions. Or if everything had to be through email versus our live sessions, how it's instantaneous. You know what I mean? Like it makes our world seem smaller, and it makes it so much faster and more efficient. And then by the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had the first actual telephone now where you don't even have to send message. You can talk. You can do it live time. It's so cool how far we've come. Now, with every positive though, there is a negative, and I try to kind of stress that, okay? With change, it always comes at a cost. And I want you to see that. Revolution always has a price. Always. So political, it's bloodshed because people don't want to give up power. And so there's always going to be people that are going to die. It's just a part of it. Economic, the Industrial Revolution, the hardship is going to be on the poor, people's quality of life. Okay? So here's what I mean by that. The rich get richer off the backs of the poor. Okay, and so how does this happen? Well, it's the quality of life. So all those people I talked about that were living in the cities, right, or that were living on the farms and had to rush into the cities to find jobs, there was nowhere for them to live. So literally they put up row housing, And urbanization is going to happen so fast, people moving into the cities, that there was nowhere for them to live. So cities had to quickly build what was called row housing, which is kind of what you see, which is literally just rows of houses. So two-story apartments, okay? Two-roomed apartments. So the front room of the apartment would be like your kitchen, sitting area, the back room, a bedroom, 2 stories. And they would just build rows of it. No indoor plumbing, no indoor, no running water. There would be a communal toilet, basically an outhouse. You'd have to go to the communal, water source. And so people are throwing their trash in the streets, close quarters. Sometimes you have 8, 10 people in a 2-bedroom, a 2-room, not 2-bedroom, 2-room apartment, okay? That you and I would think of, would be tight for a family of 4 to be in, you'd have an extended family in. And so unfortunately, the poverty is going to increase. The quality of life for poor is going to get worse. The quality of life for the rich is going to get better. So the gap between the rich and the poor increases. The rich get richer at the expense of the poor because the poor are working in the factories at minuscule jobs that they could be replaced with at any time. And the rich are getting richer, right? Because they're producing faster and equipment is so much better, they're making more money off of cheap labor and technology. Okay, so let's talk about what the factories were like. What were people going through?
Factory work was much different from the system of cottage industry. Under the old system, cloth merchants had a fairly close relationship with their workers and generally took an interest in their well-being. But large factories and rigid production schedules did not allow for much familiarity between owners and workers. And factory work was more tiring than home manufacturing, even though the factories kept the same 12 to 14-hour work schedule, 6 days a week, that the cottage workers had followed. Factory work had greater production demands, was very monotonous, and few breaks were allowed. Plus, working conditions in factories were much worse than in cottage settings. Many of the earliest factories, referred to by labor reformers as the dark, satanic mills, were noisy and dangerous places in which to work, full of dust and fumes. It often resulted in permanent physical damage to workers. Children, robbed of their childhoods, worked long hours in the mills, and women and children were paid only a fraction of what the men earned. Many mill owners believed that the lower classes had to be kept poor in order to make them industrious. But even though wages were low, at least workers could rely on them, so that they rarely faced the extreme poverty they had known in the past. Although the working classes did not at first share in the wealth created by the Industrial Revolution, the middle and upper classes prospered, and great fortunes were made as wealth shifted from the hands of land-owning aristocrats to factory-owning capitalists. One famous social critic of the time, who worked to bring about changes in the law to benefit the poor working classes, was Charles Dickens. His books offer vivid portrayals of life during the first Industrial Revolution. And Karl Marx, a Dickens contemporary, who lived in England for much of his life, wrote his 2 famous books, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, in response to the social injustices he witnessed as a result of industrialization. During the time of Marx and Dickens, many factories had switched to coal instead of water as a source of power. The problem with using water or wind to run machines was that they could be unreliable sources of energy. A windmill couldn't operate on windless days, and a water-powered factory came to a complete halt during dry spells. Factory work
So what were factory conditions like? Well, 12 to 16-hour days. You know, it was 6 days a week. Sundays were their only days off. Many, many accident safety issues. And if you got injured or you had an accident, you were fired. There was no workman's comp. There was no unemployment. You have to understand there were literally no benefits. It was a free capitalist society. So it was dog eat dog. It was you were replaced and you were out of luck. Women were preferred over men. Did anybody catch why? Well, they were easier to manipulate. They could pay them less, and they didn't have as many rights. Men didn't tend to put up as much guff, so to speak, being bullied around, and women were meeker, and so men could push them around more and pay them less for doing the same work. And it was exhausting. And so that's why the quality of life went down for most of the poor. Working longer hours, less wages, the living conditions were worse. They didn't have their own farms, their own autonomy anymore. And it really was horrible. Probably the most sought after labor group were children, okay? Here's how low they would go. So it was factory owners, what they would do, some places did outlaw like child labor, some didn't. Families were desperate for income, and so if a area forbid child labor, then what a factory owner could do is he might go to the local orphanage, and I'm kind of doing quotes when I say this, quotes, would go and would adopt 10 children. Oh, really? You're single, sir, and 50, and you want 10 children? Yes, I'm just feeling very generous, Come say hello to Papa Tom, whatever. No, he's doing that. He's going to house them at the factory. He's going to feed them next to nothing, and he's going to work them to death, basically. And if they get injured, then so be it, and he's not going to pay for their medical costs. And this child is an example of that. Now, the reason they wanted them, again, easy to manipulate them, pay them next to nothing, and they're very small, so they could fit in between the machines, so they could send them in to retrieve things or to fix things, and they wouldn't have to stop the machinery. So many children were injured. Many children were injured, and again, no protection for them. And if they weren't, just the least of it would be having permanent physical deformity. A lot of them would die due to infections or disease or, lack of medical care. I mean, it was absolutely horrific. Again, the rich getting richer at the expense of the poor. And this is what I'm talking about. Their quality of life getting worse. At what expense? Ooh, something I want to mention, okay, because this always come up in class, but we're not face-to-face. What happens when a woman has a child? What do you do? Well, if she's lucky, she has an older relative at home she can leave the child with, but what if she doesn't? So here's what she would have to do. She brings the baby with her to work and nurses it when she can, but she can't have that baby crying. She could get fired. She can't be off work that long, maybe a week or so. She's got to go back to work. So what a lot of women would have to do is they would have to give their babies opioids in their bottle or a little bit of alcohol in their bottle, basically drug their baby to try to keep their baby woozy from crying too much. And so unfortunately, a lot of women accidentally would overdose their babies. Now, this is easy to sit here and judge and be like, oh, how I would never do that to my child. Well, if you're desperate to have a job to feed your family, don't say what you wouldn't do. These women were put in horrible conditions. There was no maternity leave. There was no child care. They couldn't afford it. If they were lucky and had someone at home, that's great, but they couldn't stay home. They had to work. And it was absolutely atrocious, and there was no involvement or protection for them. So that's what I'm saying. The Industrial Revolution had a cost. So here were some of the new social beliefs that came out of these. Okay, sorry about that. Here are some of the new social ideas that came out of this, okay? Some believe that utilitarianism was the best thing, okay? That the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, all right? And this never really quite took off, but some people kind of built on this with the idea of limited capitalism, or democracy as we kind of see it today. Socialism became a big movement, the idea that people as a whole should own everything. And stuff. So we do see some socialist systems like universal healthcare, right? That, like, say in Canada has, in fact, we really are the only Western nation that doesn't have universal healthcare. All Western European nations have it. Canada has it, and stuff. So what it is, it's the concept of that there's just one health system and everybody's in that health system. Now, if you want private insurance, you pay above and beyond that, but everyone automatically, because of their taxes or what they pay for in their taxes, gets health care, okay? And it's in one system, so it's universal, okay, that everyone has it. So you could argue that we have some socialist systems in our country. For instance, the idea of like auto insurance. Like if you're going to own a car, right, you have to have auto insurance. Now we could get it from different places, but the concept of it and the way we have it and what it does is universal, right? It's this idea that everyone must have it. Everyone does the same thing with it. So we have socialism ideas in our country, but we're very hesitant, at least thus far, about socialism in our country. We lean this way. We do hear about universal health care, you know, sometimes in campaigns, and that has a lot of mixed reactions and stuff like that. But to give you an idea of what it is. This is also the time when Karl Marx will come up with his idea of communism, the Communist Manifesto. Okay, and this is actually going to be our primary resource. We are going to be reading an excerpt from the Communist Manifesto. Communism, when we hear this, we immediately, everybody cringes, right? We're like, oh, we can't talk about this. Oh, this is such a bad word. It doesn't, you know, it's automatically in any country that, you know, is communist, you know, we immediately have a reaction to it. In fact, you know, if you had to name communist countries today, you know, there's, I believe 5 total: China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam, right, that are communist today. And stuff, you know, and stuff. So communism doesn't work, and I am in no way, shape, or promoting. And we'll talk about why communism doesn't work. But I first want to talk about where it started. Karl Marx started in Germany, and he went into English and German factories. And here's what it was. He makes a historical argument for saying that in history, there is a history of the bourgeoisie, the haves, the rich, taking advantage of the proletariat, the have-nots, the poor. Okay, and if you read the excerpt, when you read the excerpt of the Communist Manifesto from our primary resource that we're going to have for chapter 24, he's going to give a historical argument for this. He's going to say this goes all the way back to the Romans, and he uses the patrician and the plebeians as the example, that the rich get richer off the backs of the poor. And then he talks about the Dark Ages, and he talks about how the feudal lords get richer off the backs of serfs. Then he talks about the French Revolution even, and he talks about how the first and second estate get richer off the backs of the third estate, right? How the first and second estate pay no taxes, but the third estate pays all the taxes, okay? Example after example after example in history, right? Where the rich get richer off the backs of the poor. Back in the Roman Empire, it caused revolt. Look at the Dark Ages. The serfs had terrible existence. Look at the French Revolution. It led to revolution, okay? The revolt, okay? And he's saying the same thing is happening in the Industrial Revolution. The bourgeoisie, the upper class, are taking advantage of the proletariat, the lower class. And he wasn't wrong. He went into the factories and he said, look at how they're being treated. Look how poor they're being treated. Look at women and children and the living conditions. Look at how terrible, and look at how great these other people are living. And this is not okay. We have to fix it. Now, so when you look at his argument, okay, you're like, yeah, that's not okay. Nobody wants to see the rich get richer at the expense of the poor and poor people suffer. You know, you understand his concept. So communism was his solution, okay? And his solution was this idea, okay, that a government would come in and would oversee and make sure that this doesn't happen. Now, when you hear it that way, it doesn't sound that bad. And he goes into greater detail. I'm drastically simplifying this, oversimplifying this, okay? But just to help you understand the roots of communism. Have you ever like had a great idea? You're like, this is going to be such a great idea. And then you do it and everything goes bad. Karl Marx, when you read about communism and you read about his history, if you were to take communism out, I bet a lot more people would think it was a good idea. And then if you were to reveal to them actually what you just read about was communism, they would be shocked. You'd be like, what? That's not communism. No, because when we think of communism today, right, we think of negatives. We think of Russia and the Cold War and, you know, the whole Cold War. We think of, like we say, North Korea or Cuba. We think of negative connotations. Now, I'm not promoting communism. I'm about ready to link it together. You're like, well, Miss Hall, you're taking a really long time getting there, okay? Karl Marx is using history and really good arguments in history to say we have to do something that the rich don't keep The rich can't keep getting richer at the expense of the poor. Now, it's not saying you shouldn't have rich. It doesn't mean that you're not always going to have poor, but it's not fair, this gap, right? And how abused the poor are at the expense of the rich. You know what I mean? Like, that's not fair. Okay, that's what he's saying. And if you have half a heart, you get what I'm saying, the extreme abuse of it, right? Not everything can be fair, but the extremism of it, right? You can follow with what I'm saying. So he has this idea of how to fix it. So you can empathize with where he's coming from. But the problem is the actual execution of it just leads to a government dictatorship. It leads to a single party dictatorship. The first example of communism that we're going to see is going to epically fail. Okay, is going to epically fail, and that's going to be in Russia. All right, with the Russian Revolution after World War I, when Lenin and then later Stalin tried to set up communism, and it will epically fail. And they're going to try to do it after their czar keeps getting richer at the expense of their poor and drags them into a war and refuses to leave the war. It doesn't matter that they're starving. The rich get richer off the backs of the poor. It doesn't matter how poor your people are. It doesn't matter how much they're suffering. I'm going to do whatever I want. So it brings in communism to try to change things. And all it unfortunately does is makes things worse. Communism is, in theory, sounds great, but in execution, unfortunately, always leads to a single party corrupt government, a single party dictatorship. So instead of having one person dictatorship, it's a single party dictatorship where people give up their rights. So in theory, when you read about it, and that's why we're going to read this excerpt, we're going to talk about this more in a live session with the Communist Manifesto. I'm not promoting communism, so I want you to hear me clearly, but it is a really good, it is very eye-opening to understand the roots of it, because I think when people hear Karl Marx, they don't unnecessarily understand always his roots. And when you look at the roots of the article and where he was coming from, it's easy to see where he had some good intentions, but it just bad in execution, bad in theory. So you can maybe respect where he was coming from, but the idea and execution is going to epically fail, and communism is definitely one of those. And we'll talk more about that. New directions of businesses, we're going to see more and more monopolies or cartels, so to speak, right, that can control entire industries. A great example of that would be like the Rockefeller family oil industry, or the steel industry, or refineries, or things like that. And so this is going to be an example of that abuse of power, the laissez-faire, the free market, when there's no government oversight, how the rich get richer at the expense of the poor, to the point where there are going to be monopolies in industry that can literally just abuse their power so much that it destroys entire industries, or takes advantage of governments even, and stuff. And so governments eventually are going to have to step in to limit this, or to be careful of this, because then even governments can fall victim to this. Cities will grow exponentially during these times. You know, why? Well, there's a few reasons. Death rates will start to fall. Because of these new technologies, there will be advancements in sterilization, in medicine, and things like that. With improved farming methods, there is more food, so therefore with a surplus of food, the costs go down, right? When you have high supply, the costs go down. So when there's a shortage, the cost goes up. So we do see people have more access to food, and the availability of food goes up. And there is improvements in medical advancement, and sanitation does really help in hospitals. So that does help with treatment. So that you have to think back in the 1700s, a lot of people that went into hospitals died because sanitation was so terrible. They would do surgery on you, right? And, you know, or something with that knife, and they would just wipe it off with cold water, not realizing that infection they took to you, now they're going to take to the next person, right? And that cross contamination was maybe more deadly than what the people were actually suffering from. So some of the new medicines, vaccinations, you know, for rabies, bacteria buildup, you know, for TB, tuberculosis was huge. Hospitals, the idea of anesthesia was really, really big. Sanitation was so big. Understanding what that is. Oh, that we actually have to sanitize our knives and bed sheets and things like that, you know. Antiseptics for infection, you know, basic penicillin changes the game for very simple infections that you and I take for granted, that people back in the day would have died from. So very, very simple things that now that can be treated, 150 years ago, people would have died from. And so it's really little things that can go a really long way in survival rates.
Before improvements in transportation, factories were built in areas where iron and coal mines were close at hand. These areas, where mines, factories, and workers crowded together, developed into industrial cities, and they almost immediately became difficult places in which to live. Here, the water and air became terribly polluted, as dark clouds of smoke poured from factory chimneys, from ovens where coal was converted into coke, and from the fireplaces in the simple homes of thousands of miners and factory workers. Everything was covered with a dark layer of soot. Industrial waste and sewage fouled the rivers and streams. And the land that only recently had been green and fertile was torn up as more and more mines and factories appeared, and new rows of workers' houses sprouted up in the nearby fields. These industrial towns were dreary, overcrowded, and unhealthy places to raise a family. But eventually changes started to be made to benefit the workers. A handful of enlightened industrialists created a few model villages for workers, and these were a great improvement over how they had lived before. Later in the 19th century, many other social improvements followed. Laws banning labor unions were repealed, and child labor was outlawed. Although there were plenty of economic bad times, the working classes had reached a point where they sometimes had extra money to spend. In fact, they now made up a vast new market for the manufactured goods they helped produce. Wealth, it seemed, created more wealth. Free public schools were instituted all across England for the very first time, resulting in the first working-class generation that was able to read and write. These new educational skills provided some young people with a ticket away from a dreary future in the mines and factories to better paying, less monotonous jobs.
So life in the cities. Life in the cities was very hard. The slums were very hard, crime rates, alcoholism, but they improved very, very slowly. So slowly as sanitation, indoor plumbing, light bulbs, railroad cars, things like that moved to these lower income areas. They slowly caught up, and so to speak, in some ways. What were some of the environmental impacts of the Industrial Revolution? Deforestation. For construction and fuel. Coal, air pollution was terrible, especially near the factories. So these low income areas, the air quality, breathing problems was really often the problem or common. They call it black lung, or that lung that people would get from being near it and breathing and all that soot. Population density, water and sanitation was probably one of the biggest issues. Coal replacing wood, which obviously didn't help air quality. Cotton replacing wool. Wood for ships. To iron. There was a lot of issues that people were facing, but slowly but surely there was shifts, and there were social programs put in place. Loan programs for people who wanted to start businesses, public education, laws restricting child labor. So slowly but surely, the laissez-faire free market, people realized this couldn't keep going. They couldn't keep going. And the government had to step in and make some changes and improve the quality of life in these lower areas. The reality is that the largest portion of the population is always the poor. And eventually, if you don't meet their needs, they will revolt. This is how the American Revolution, French Revolution, this is how revolutions start. How do revolutions start? They don't start by the upper class. They start by the lower class who are exhausted, who are tired. And eventually, their threat of riot gets the attention, okay? That injured workers needed to be compensated and cared for, that all men should be able to vote. Women, unfortunately, were coming, but not quite yet, okay? Unions started to organize to keep factory owners from being able to pit one group against another, because what they would do oftentimes, let's say, for instance, in the big cities like Chicago or New York, what they would do is they would pit ethnic groups against each other or cultural groups against each other. So let's say like in New York, for example, like the Italians against the Irish. And so they would pit them against each other and outbid each other. So the Irish might take, 10 cents an hour and the Italians might take 9 cents an hour. And so the unions helped to create some unity amongst the lower classes to keep the factory owners more accountable. And pass laws again, only 8 hours in a workday, disability if you were injured, outlawed child labor laws, so children weren't working, they could go to school, at least some education. Now, it was still very, very lenient and not anything like it is today, but at least was a step in the right direction. There were changing attitudes, upper class, old nobility plus super rich business class families. They were kind of becoming a thing of the past. There was a new higher upper class, the new rich who had taken loans and found success in their new businesses, in their new trade industries or opening factories, and a new lower middle class that is starting to develop in professionals. So there's a slowly but surely the gap between the rich and the poor, which was old money and just the poor. There's new money and there's a middle class that has never been there before. So it changes the social structure. And let me tell you, the old money, the upper class that's been inherited, they didn't like this at all. They didn't like the new money. They were intimidated by it, especially from the Americas. The social values. Children were to be seen, not heard. Marriage, became less and less about business and more for love. The idea that women should be in the home and caring for the home. So more and more of a push for women not to be working in factories and to be caring within the home for the children, that it was a man's job to, make the money and women were to be domestic. That really became more solidified during this era. But we also see the beginning of the women's suffrage movement really starting in the 1850s, 1860s, that women wanted the right to vote. They didn't want their husband's opinion to count as their opinion. They wanted to be treated as equals. That no, he doesn't just speak for me. I'm not just some little lady. I want to have an opinion. Now, the pushback was that people felt, well, women are just too emotional, or they should be protected from, the horrible things of society. That's what their husband's for. And women, oh, you're just too fragile for this, right? And us women were like, no, 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 we can handle it. It's fine. New sciences of the day, just early discoveries of early human remains really began to push the idea of creation and religion versus science. The idea of Darwinism will become big. Charles Darwinism is going to be a huge controversy in the 1800s. Up to this point, the only thing taught in schools is when I say in schools, I'm talking about Westernization, which is Christian, right, at this time, especially Catholic. The only thing taught in schools is the Christian version of the origins of man, okay? So idea of creation. And so Charles Darwin's, origins of species and the idea of evolution, right? So controversial. Huge movement against this, created so much controversy in schools, really, really big. So science starting to push back on religious movements. So kind of, the same pushback we saw during the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution. We're going to see huge outrage in schools in this movement that it was a threat to religion, and people really push back on these kind of movements. There's going to be changes in art, more of a romanticism, bold art, orchestra. This is the time of Beethoven, very emotional music, Bach, things like that. Realism became very big, and the first photography right here is in 1839. This was the first photo taken, and this exposure took 40 minutes. Okay, so you and I take a photo on our phone, takes less than a millisecond, right? This first exposure took 40 minutes. 40 minutes to get that photo. Okay, 40 minutes to get that photo and stuff. But still, the first photography, to capture things as they are, okay? That romanticism kind of starts to go away, and the realism of life starts to become more important to people, because what they're really living is not romantic. It's hard, it's dark, it's damp, it's difficult, it's not sanitary, right? It's a struggle. Okay, real quick, it's important that you know some of the economic theories, so we're going to go through them really, really fast to make sure you define what each of these are, and then we'll be done. Okay, so what is capitalism? Well, capitalism is the idea of a free market, right? So government has little to no involvement, so laissez-faire is what capitalism is in motion. So laissez-faire is a concept, but capitalism is that in motion. So capitalism, if you're going to define it, is free market, little to no government involvement. So private business, right? Land and business owned privately. So if your parent owns their own business, that is capitalism. We live in a capitalist society that has regulations, right? So the government gives regulations to, let's say your parent owns a business. The government gives your parents regulations like how many hours a week their employees can work, how they can treat them. They can't cuss them out, right? You can't, sexually harass people. You can't discriminate against people because of their race or ethnicity or religion. So they give guidelines to your parents. But at the end of the day, whether or not your parent's business succeeds or fails is on your parent, right? Is on that family. Okay? The government doesn't interfere with that. So laissez-faire is a part of that. It's this idea of free market. Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith really pushed this in his book, this idea of why this was good, okay? And America, the United States, is definitely going to be probably one of the best examples of really pushing this, okay? That this theory should go forward. And the Industrial Revolution is definitely defined by laissez-faire, free market. What we're eventually going to see by the end of the Industrial Revolution is the hard lesson that a total free market with no boundaries is dangerous, right? You have to have some regulation. You have to have some boundaries, because look at what happened to the poor. Look at what happened to women and children and the factories. Like, you can't have no regulation. So you can have a free market. It's kind of like, You can have a loose cow or a loose horse, but you have to have a fence up. So you can have a free market, but within fences, right? Within 40-hour work week, with minimum wage, with safe work environment, with workman's comp, with no discrimination, with certain boundaries so that people are at least having a humane treatment in that work environment. Utilitarianism was the idea that government needs to take responsibility and improve the lives of everyone, desires laws that limited child labor, improved public health. This had some momentum, but it promoted too much government involvement at the time, so never really took off in the very popular laissez-faire capitalist society that was the Industrial Revolution. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto came out during this time. Now, there was no communist governments at the time. Like I said, we won't see the first example of communism until Russia after World War II, or after World War I, sorry, in 1920. But remember that he based this on the Industrial Revolution and saying that the laissez-faire free market was dangerous. And he's saying the proletariat is the victim of the bourgeoisie, and he used history as an example of that. So we do see a lot of different economic and political theories come out of the Industrial Revolution. So people say, how do we deal with all these economic changes and not hurt people? And so there's a lot of theories of that. Some say free market, some say utilitarianism, some say communism, Now, all these have pros and cons, some more than others, and the reality is that it's probably somewhere in the middle, is what you kind of come to at the end of it. Scientific socialism, Karl Marx also promoted. He says the entire course of history was a class struggle between the haves and the have-nots. The modern class structure pitted the bourgeoisie against the proletariat working class. So he used that argument, which is what I explained earlier in the lecture, right? The history of the patrician and the plebeian, the history of the vassal and the serfs, the history of the third estate and the first and second estate, and now the bourgeoisie proletariat. And he's saying we have to do something to change it. And that's how he comes up with this concept of communism. So if you're comparing and contrasting capitalism and communism, they couldn't be any more different, right? They're complete opposites. So if you have a spectrum, right? Capitalism's on one end, communism, Karl Marx's theories on the other end, okay? Capitalism is absolutely no government oversight. Communism is total government oversight. Everything is owned by the government. And so my question to you is, where are we? Where is the United States? So socialism is not communism, but it's definitely closer to communism. So on the spectrum, it's not in the middle. It's probably between the middle and communism, So where are we? Where is the United States? Well, we claim to be capitalists, and we are, but we're not pure capitalists, right? We have rules and regulations. We have minimum wage. We have 40-hour work weeks. We have workman's comp, right? We have a lot of regulations on our banking industries, our tax industries, our working industries. Think about restaurants, all the regulations they have to follow to make sure that we have, food that is quality and they have to be rated. Every industry, the tax industry, every industry is regulated by the government. So we have a free market, but it's a very limited market. So I would argue that we're somewhere in the middle. We're what's called a limited capitalist society, okay? We have a free market within the boundaries or the fences that are laid out. And I argue to you, isn't this good? Do we want to see the free market of the Industrial Revolution where women, children, people, minorities can literally be abused and there's absolutely no protection, where if you're injured, you can just be fired, where children can just be injured and sent to work, where there's no sanitation, where there's no protection for individuals? Of course we don't want to see that. But we also don't want to see a society, and we're going to talk about when we get to Russia and these other communist countries, why communism never works. Communism never works. When we read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx had grandiose ideas, and you can empathize with where he's coming from in his historical argument. But the reality is that when it's put into practice, all you're doing is handing people hand over their individual rights. And by giving up their rights, the government has control of everything. And in that, individual freedom is gone, and you have basically a government dictatorship again. So instead of a single dictatorship, you have a communist party dictatorship that tells everybody what to do and abuses their power. And every single time there's abuse of power. Russia, we'll see it. In China, we see it. In North Korea, we see it. In Cuba, we see it. In Laos, we see it. In Vietnam, we see it. We've never seen an instance where communism didn't turn into a single party dictatorship. We haven't seen it because humans are naturally selfish. So the reality is, we could go back almost to the Chinese example. What is best? What creates the most balanced, long-standing society? Now, I don't have the perfect answer, but I will say this. The best predictor of the future is the past, right? Some of the longest standing societies in history are some of the Chinese dynasties that go 700-800 years. And a lot of those dynasties were ones that practiced Confucianism, middle road, right? Compromise. Not all the way legalism, not all the way Taoism, right? Not all the way communism, not all the way pure capitalism. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm being philosophical, all right? We need a free market, but we need some oversight, right? We have to have a government to keep boundaries. But we also want freedoms, right? We want the opportunity to start a business, to dream, right? Don't you want to have a future? Or do you want the government to tell you what you're going to do and what you're going to make? I don't know about you. I want self-determination. Don't you want to be able to decide what you want to be when you grow up? Like, you have to have a free market for that. The opportunity to make it, to break through in an industry, that's exciting. You can't do that in communism, you know? But at the same time, don't we want protections that make sure that we watch out for people, that we don't see the atrocities of the Industrial Revolution, the abuses of people? I mean, anyone with half a heart, we don't want to see that. So the reality is what creates a long-lasting society? Well, look at history. What creates the long-lasting societies is usually a balance, right? So in the Industrial Revolution, what's going to create that balance? It's somewhere in the middle. And I would argue, not that we're perfect by any means. It's something you constantly have to readjust, right? But I would say it's something that we work really hard at, right? That the government is constantly trying to give balance, give regulation, but keep free market. Now, some of your parents would say there's way too much government oversight, right? Some of your parents would say there needs to be more government oversight. Well, welcome to difference of opinions, right? But I think we can all agree that there has to be at least some government oversight, right? We can't have total free. And I think we can all agree we don't want to lose all freedom. So the question then becomes, what is that balance, right? And then that becomes the ongoing debate that we always have, right? The difference of opinion is, what is that right balance? What is too much? What is too little? And the reality is that that's always shifting. You know, it's always shifting with the time. But I want you to take past and I want you to apply it to our present and understand that history is so relevant to what we are going through today. All right, you are awesome. I know this was a lot, but I hope you took notes. We went over a lot of the stuff that was in the chapter questions. I went over, some of those ideologies. So, laissez-faire, utilitarianism, positivism, utopianism, communism, capitalism, socialism. I went over them. And I hope number 6 you're going to have to go over, but I went over a lot of those things. So you guys are awesome, and I'll talk to you soon.